Well, good afternoon. My name is Wolfgang Gansberg-Gruber. I'm the Liechtenstein Institute and Self-Determination, but I'm presenting today, really with great pleasure, a session which is above and beyond the realm of pure self-determination and goes into this notion which Madame Condoleezza Rice has brought into a Foreign Affairs article in the year 2000, saying the hemispheric perspective of global politics. It is my great honor and personal pleasure to introduce to you the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Mr. José Miguel Insulza, and I would like to do so particularly also in the name of my close friend and colleague, President José Manuel Barroso, who is here from the European Union. We are going to hear today a practitioner's perspective how and what are both the essence, the contemporary situation, and hopefully potential some ways to respond to the challenges which the Americas go through currently. And I would say they are actually symbolic for many other parts of the world also. And obviously, as we all know, many states of the Americas are becoming today key actors in a changing global context. Should I only think of Brazil and Venezuela and other states, which really shape the international situation far and beyond the hemisphere itself. Secretary General Insulza has been Secretary General now for 2 periods and is actually, I would say, one of the most senior, experienced politicians in that region. He is originally a lawyer by profession and has served as a professor of political theory at the University of Chile and also of political science at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. From 1973 on, he then, and perhaps even before, Professor Insulza, or Secretary General Insulza, played an active role in Salvador Allende's Popular Unity government. And after the coup of General Augusto Pinochet, he left Chile and spent more than 6 years in Rome, and then went back to Mexico and basically returned to Chile in the late 1988. That was precisely the time when the world was changed for many other reasons. 1989, we had the fall of the Berlin Wall. So he came back at that point into Chile. And he joined the Parties for Democracy, and that coalition won the plebiscite against Pinochet. And I was thinking, given the term and notion what the plebiscite means today after Crimea, so that was certainly a very important plebiscite in this case, and a positive plebiscite for the country. And then in March 1994, under President Eduardo Frei, he became Foreign Secretary, and from then on eventually entered the hemispheric politics, in that he was then in 2000 elected Secretary General of the OAS. What is a particular trait of this gentleman, apparently, is, and I got introduced to this by Joschka Fischer when he said once to me, if you're a politician, you have to stand for certain things, and if you get attacked, so be it, the next day. And you have in your career, sir, clearly stood up to the principles which you found are important and right. And even if you were attacked, like from Venezuela, for instance, you withstood this, and at the end of the day, it turned out you were right. So we are very honored to have you here in Princeton, not only to speak to us about your evaluations and perspectives on the situation of the Americas, but also to be of symbolic value for our next generation of leaders who could perhaps learn one or the other thing from your career. Welcome to Princeton, sir.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the very kind introduction. As you say, I've been around at the Organization of American States for almost 10 years. A few days ago, a new Secretary General was elected. In fact, I'm leaving my post by the end of May. At least there's one place in which you can only get re-elected twice. Once, I mean, I was elected for the first time in 2005, and re-elected in 2010, and it's time to go home. And actually, I think they have been very challenging years. I will be talking mainly about the basic trends in Latin America. I will not be referring very directly to the crisis and the problems that we face. Usually when you go to places in this country, people ask about Venezuela and Cuba and practically that. I mean, some will probably refer also to crime in Central America or things like that. But I think we can discuss those problems if you want. I will be very happy to talk about it. But I will be more referring to the region as a whole and the region in which I've had to deal recently. I will, at the end, make a few comments on hemispheric affairs, which I think are very important. I think it's very relevant to in the coming years. But actually, I should begin by saying that the decade that goes from 2012 to 2002, and 2012, were particularly positive for Latin America, and I would say Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole. The region enjoyed a very, very healthy economic performance. Its share of the world economy went from about a little over 5% to a little more than 7%, which means something that was completely rare, that Latin America had been losing part of its share of the world economy, falling every time. Even in the periods of growth, the world economy was growing faster than Latin America, and this was a occasion in which the same thing didn't happen now. And in spite of the recession, this economic growth continued. I mean, most of the economic growth, of course, as you know, however, was engineered by exports, the growth in exports. The size of exports of our region grew very much. The prices of exports also went up. And of course, usually, to give the example that everybody gives, in Latin American exports to China went from 4 billion in 2002 to 71 billion in 2012. And that was quite a big thing for our region. Now, growth, by the way, was this time triggered some remarkable achievements also. Nearly 70 million people were lifted from poverty. The rate of poor went from 43% to 2002 to 28% in 2012. And if you examine the region as a developing region should be examined under the scope of the UN Millennium Goals, most of the countries in the region, except for a very small number of very poor countries, were really very much fulfilled the Millennium Goals. Now, that situation has changed. Has changed, and I will refer to that change in a moment. But I should say that the democracy was also very much a success in the region in 2002, in this period. Just to say what I'm referring to, I'm talking basically about two matters that are very important. One was the number of democratic governments that were elected. In the last 2 decades, we've elected almost only democratic governments in the region, in Latin America, and in the Caribbean also. We have 34 members of the Organization of American States, 34 active members. Of course, Cuba is a member of the Organization of American States. It was never expelled. We lifted the sanctions against Cuba 6 years ago. It's still a member, but I'm talking about the acting members. All the acting members of the Organization of American States have a democratically elected government. And we have observed elections for the past 20 or 25 years. Half of those observing missions were during my tenure. We have observed 105 elections in the past 10 years. And they have all been have passed the democratic test. We have democratically elected governments, and that's, of course, it's not all democracy. Democracy is, as we're going to see, some more also other important things, but from the point of view of the origin of government, we have a country of democratic, I mean the other continent of democratic government together with Europe. At the same time, I would say that one should say a word in favor of stability. Because actually, we had very fragile democracies at the beginning in the 80s and the 90s, and that was shown by the fact that between 1990 and 2005, when I came to the OAS, in that decade and a half, 17 governments in the region, and I'm talking here only about Latin America, not about the Caribbean countries, which are also a part of my organization. Among I would say 17 governments of Latin America did not end their tenure at the moment they were predicted to. I mean, this doesn't mean that all suffered coups. There were some coups, of course, and there were some other matters, but basically it also had to do with the impeachment. It had to do with the corruption issues and the resignation of presidents, or simply the resignation on matters because of a matter of a general crisis in the country, as well the last two I had to deal with when I was just joining the OAS, which were Bolivia and Ecuador. When my first General Assembly was about a week after being elected, and the government of Bolivia announced its resignation at that moment. In the next 10 years, in the 10 years that followed, only two countries had problems of, finished their terms prematurely. One was a coup. I'm talking about how the OAS defined it. The 34 members of the OAS defined what happened in Honduras in 2010 as a coup. It was a coup in the sense, some people in this country for some reason have said that this was a legitimate overthrow, or impeachment of the government. But actually, the president was impeached in the afternoon, and he had been sent, put on in his pajamas in the morning, put on a plane and thrown to Costa Rica. So actually, that was an old-fashioned coup. We had one of those in my country in the 1930s, when the president was forced to leave the palace by gun, threatening with a gun. And my country, by the way, is not one in which those things happen very, very frequently. But this was an old-fashioned coup. The other case was in Paraguay. In that case, I should say that the majority of the members of the Organization of American States, with the exception of some South American countries, they decided that that was not properly a coup, that there was necessary to take a lot of measures to restore the normalcy in the country, but that was basically a decision of the Congress against the president. I myself, I must admit that I didn't very much agree for the reasons that they had, but it was a Congress doing it according to the Constitution, so it was decided it was not a coup. Anyway, those are the only two cases in the past 15 years, and that is certainly for Latin America is also a very impressive success. However, we still have many problems with democracy. Especially because, as you know, Latin America, the whole of the Americas, the Organization of American States, approved in 2001 what we call the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which sets a lot of other conditions for democracy. In the old discussion, if democracy is just about the generation of government and freedom is another, and the rights and human and citizen rights are on another category, the OAS very clearly spelled out that that democracy encompassed also the issues of human rights, freedom of expression, plurality of political organizations, free elections, of course, and all the issues of governance in general were included in that charter. Of course, that charter is not fully enforced in every country of the region, but we see it as a certain a document in which you can compare what's going on in your country and see how far you have gone in matters of democracy. That part certainly is not as favorable today as it was as it was in the first two characteristics I said. We have democratically elected governments, we have stable governments, but we're still lagging behind in several matters, and are faced with several challenges which we must admit do exist. Now, before going into those challenges, will be the third part of what I'm going to say, I think that the region is today faced by a situation quite different from the one in 2000 that we faced in the previous decade. In the last 2 years, I would say, in the last 3 years in a row, because the predictions for 2005 are not very promising, we have been having lower economic growth from one year to the other. The region growth fell from in some countries to almost 0 to almost 1% or 0.1% last year, as it was in Brazil. This year is not predicted to grow anymore. And again, Latin America in general is going to have I would say, a moderate growth, but much slower than it was in the previous years. As I said before, in some places, it's true we did not accompany the crisis, but we accompanied the slow turn that we had after the crisis. Latin America is going to grow in the next year at least less than the whole of the world economy. You must always remember that in the case of Latin America, you have a special situation because two of the countries of Latin America, which are Brazil and Mexico, amount by close to 2/3 of the size of the economic size of the region. And certainly the slowdown of Brazil and the not so good growth of Mexico, which was expected to grow more, are very much determinant in these matters. There are some countries, of course, who have made a good progress, who have continued making good progress. I should mention the Dominican Republic, Panama, Paraguay, and even Bolivia recently. But that's not enough to balance the size of the other countries that are growing very low. So we expect a growth of around 2.1 to 2.5 according to the predictions for this year, and that certainly is much less than we had in the previous decade. Now, and this is something that we have learned in economic terms in Latin America. We have usually have a history of economic successes and economic setbacks, and we carry several historic burdens which are never easy to shed permanently. The prospects of the region are complicated by changes in response to some three main factors: declining trade, moderation of commodity prices, and uncertainty surrounding external monetary and financing conditions. This is a consequence, of course, of things that happen around the world. The slowdown in China's economy has been very strong against some countries in the south, especially some countries in the south. This should not be exaggerated when you talk about the region. I mean, the countries that have made it big with China are usually countries such as my own Chile, in terms of copper, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay in matters of Uruguay and Paraguay in matters of export of food products or staples of all kinds. Those countries are certainly suffering more from the slowdown than other countries in Central America and Mexico. Actually, in countries such as Central America and Mexico, the issue is not has never been that. I mean, they haven't exported that much to China, and they have faced very much of competition from China vis-a-vis North America and our region. So but that's good. That's part of the slowdown. Another part is the fact that the prices have fallen too, but also the fact that we had another factor that was very positive in the past decade was the abundance of low interest money coming from the developing countries to the developed countries of the developing world, which Latin America enjoyed for a long time. Of course, if you look at the statistics of regional organizations such as ECLAC, for example, you usually find very, very interesting statistics about the increase of foreign investment. And foreign investment increased very, very, very highly in the past decade. For some reason, you don't find that many statistics about domestic investment, because that's one of the big problems Latin America faces. We are very low. We have very low rates of investment in the past decade and in this one. So that's another problem. Foreign investment is not coming as it went as fast as it came in the past decade. Domestic investment continues to be very low. But that is a new situation, and therefore our democracies begin to be faced with a new situation which they did not have in the past decade. And certainly the big question is how are they going to be able to face the challenges that are still are still there for our region. Which are those challenges? Well, the first one, foremost from my point of view, is the issue of inequality, poverty and inequality. As I said, poverty has gone down to 28% in the past decade. That's a very good result, but it's still 28%. And one issue about Latin America that I think it was a Brazilian president, President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who once said about Brazil, Brazil is not poor, Brazil is unfair. And that's valid for the whole region. By the way, it's valid for the whole hemisphere at this point. Because actually, as you may know, the three countries in the rankings of the OECD, the three most unequal countries among all the countries of the OECD are the United States, Chile, and Mexico. In that order, at least in measurements of the past few years. So this is an endemic problem of Latin America. It's not an endemic problem in the US, but it's a problem of the whole hemisphere at this moment. And certainly, in spite of the fact that, as I said, that poverty has declined, there is a fact that it's many people who have left poverty, or that were not poor before, are in a certain threshold of people who make homesteads that make about between $4 and $10 a day. They are not poor. They are not poor. You have to be less than that to be poor. But you are vulnerable. And the possibility that many of these people, whom Nancy Birdsall and Nora Lustig have called the strugglers, is that they may fall again below the line of poverty if the situation does not improve. And that certainly is a big problem for democracy in the region. Because, not only because of, because the system does not distribute as it should. If you compare, for example, the so-called Gini coefficient of Latin America and the one of Europe, you find that, the difference before taxes is not that much. There's a certain gap of about 0.6 points in the distribution before taxes. But after taxes, in Europe, the Gini coefficient falls a lot. In Latin America, it does not fall at all. Most countries finance themselves with indirect taxes, which are usually not taxes in which you are going to really use the taxing system to make people more equal or to distribute better income, but rather everybody pays for the expenses of the government. That's a fact. And I would say that this issue of inequality continues to follow us has followed us for all our lives. In the great boom of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when it said that countries such as Argentina, for example, and Chile, very close by, were among the best performing economies in the world, they still had immense degrees of poverty and immense degrees of inequality. So that's not a new matter, and that's something that has to be settled. And by the way, poverty and inequality is not just in Latin America. It's not just a matter of. And in the region, it's not just a matter of economic distribution. It's not just a matter of how much money you make. It also has to do with the quality of public services. It has to do with education and health and even public security, in which many people actually are not getting what they are supposed to get from their societies. I mean, if you go to Central America, you find that issue of security. We are going to talk about security in a moment, but if you go to Central America, you'll find out that about for every 4 policemen, a private policeman, there's 1 public policeman. Which means that that public service, as much as education, as much as health, is much more at the disposition of some people. And at the same time, discrimination, of course, is a matter that still exists. Being Afro-American or being a member of the indigenous population or a woman accounts for much more poverty in Latin America than the normal. The sizes of poverty among the indigenous people, among the Afro-Americans, among the monoparental homes headed by a woman is much larger than, explains more poverty than the whole, than the other just economic matters in the region as a whole. So we still have a big problem of inequality. The other big problem we have, I think, not the same in every country. There's a lot of misunderstanding there, but it's true that some countries in Latin America have rates of crime that are over 4 times the world rate of crime. Some countries in the upper part of Latin America, very few in the Caribbean, not that much in the south of Latin America. Actually, in the south of Latin America, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Uruguay, and probably Argentina have lower rates of crime than the U.S. Even though, have lower rates of murder than the U.S. They have larger rates of crime, of course. I mean, the thefts are really much larger in those countries that are here. But in terms of the indicators, that is usually the rate of homicide, I mean, the difference is very high. But that's a problem that has been plaguing the region for a long time and has become much larger lately. I would say that it's a threat for democracy for 2 reasons. One is that there's a lot of, it has to do with the solidification, the strong insertion in society of organized crime. This is not just your old-fashioned, the old-fashioned tendency to violence that Octavio Paz wrote about some time, I mean, a couple of decades ago. This is also the action of clans that control the drug market, and from the drug market have expanded to human traffic, to gun smuggling, and to several other areas of development in matters of crime in the region. That's one reason. And the other one is the subjective part. I mean, I always tell a family example. Well, my wife is here with me, so she must remember that. About 15 or 20 years ago, we went to one of her sister's house. That house just being inaugurated in a section of Mexico City, middle-class section of Mexico City, and there was these beautiful houses, not really large, small, and all the people were in the street. They were celebrating Christmas, I think it was. It was a great moment. I mean, there were no. Today, you go to the same city, at the same part of the city, and it's covered of fences. Everybody's house has house fences, and there are policemen in the doors. So people are afraid. Actually, probably the best example, the most dramatic example in this sense is that if you look at the recent polls, the Latino Barometer poll in Latin America, it says that it shows that when you ask the citizens of all the Latin American countries what are the main problems of your country today, they will mention poverty or inequality, and they will mention crime. And the most interesting thing is that the 2 countries that have least crime, which are Chile and Uruguay, is the first mention of the majority of the decisions of the citizens in the country. So we are faced with a subjective problem. And that is also a certain danger for democracy, because people talk basically only about violence. Now, where does this come from? I think it comes from the weakness many of that the states in the region have suffered in the recent past. There was a time in Latin America in the 80s and 90s, when a phrase you must all remember here in the United States, that the state is part of the problem and not part of the solution, drew many countries to privatize a slew of public services and made public spending cuts to the point that they severely hampered the already not very effective systems of health, education, public transportation, pensions, and others. Of course, this was all. It was worse because the fiscal systems in the region were not very good in general at that moment, and we have smaller states, and social demands have grown. That's greater democracy. The large chunks of the population that have left poverty and exclusion are asking for more and more opportunities. And all too often in the region, there is a growing unrest, especially among the small, the new arrivals in the middle class. They are usually called middle class, but they are not really middle class. They are demanding to have the same services and the same quality of the services to which middle class are usually entitled in other countries of the world. So I would say that we have a problem there. We have small states. The states of Latin America are small, and if you want to take care of their people as they should, they have to improve the quality of government very much, and they have to overcome a certain distance with the citizens, which is, as has been seen, has been growing too much. I would say that if I had to mention one of the causes of one of the big problems, of the political problems that we still face, is that we have democracy is quite recent in the region. And it usually replaced a certain tradition of strong leadership, sometimes democratically elected, sometimes not, but always short on accountability. Actually, there's no word in Spanish for accountability. I don't know if we've never been able to really. Rendición de cuentas is usually what's said, but that's not exactly what accountability means. It means that any authority has to be responsible to another authority or another body in society for what it does or doesn't do. I would say that the big problem is that many people that are in government today tend to look as accountability more than as an obligation of democracy, as a way in which, as an obstacle to the fulfillment of your goals, of your promises to the people. And that's why, if you look at the real problems of several countries, which you may consider, there's always difficulties with freedom of the press, or freedom of expression, non-governmental organizations, independent judiciaries, etc., are usually subject to some kind of pressure under the idea that they are, to some extent, obstacles to what the governments are trying to do. Of course, we have a region, therefore, that's faced with several issues so far. And that, excuse me, before that, I should say, the last matter is the degree of division that you see in several countries in the region. I had a chance the other day to be in El Salvador. Interesting country, a small country that is came out of a civil war, and in which very few months ago they elected a new president, and the new president won by 0.12%, 0.12% of the vote. He got 50.12%, and the contender got 49.88%, and nothing happened. And now they have just had a congressional election, and they had a very cumbersome system of election. Finally, the results came out. Nobody really claimed anything. And they have a Congress that's more or less tied, half and half, for the government and the opposition. And in spite of that, just signed a platform that all the political parties find a certain commitment to work together to solve some of the major problems of the country. That's completely inexistent in most of countries in Latin America. On the contrary, I would say that what guides the opposition is usually the contempt for the government, and the government does not have any kind of dialogue with the opposition in several countries. And I'm not talking only about Venezuela, which is the case that comes to mind. It happens almost in about half of the region, and that's another matter. I'm very much reminded of when I speak about this, about a book that, I mean, it wasn't the last book I think he published, but anyway, I'll just try to quote it. I will not quote the author right now. Charles Tilly was the author of that book, but I'm quoting him freely. He said that the three main obstacles for democracy were, first, when the caste system, when people are born and die in the same caste, the lack of rule of law for all members of society, and the lack of civic friendship, civic understanding among the different groups, and the extreme divisions in society. I would say that very much it's much more complex book. So I'm not quoting him. I'm quoting the titles, but I will say that those are the three major problems of the region today in political terms, especially to which I add this matter of accountability, which has also been very seriously developed by some authors in the region very recently. Now, this region, however, has its positive sides too. Huh? In spite of what I said about the governments, we have managed to keep, and about violence, we have managed to keep out of the main focuses of global conflict. Latin America is, referring to countries, to the countries, is a continent in which there have been no major conflicts or wars in the past 100 years, or not 100 years, almost 100 years, between the war of the Chaco, between Paraguay and Bolivia mainly. There have not been major wars in the region. Actually, we have had several conflicts. We still have several border conflicts at this moment. But countries have usually take those conflicts to the International Court of Justice. We have two records. We are the region with less conflicts among our countries, or violent conflicts, and the region that by far is the one that has gone more to the International Court of Justice in the past few decades. Of course, I'm not referring to the so-called the Malvinas War or the War of the South Atlantic. That was not between two American countries. It was between a European country and it marks a lot about the colonial era that's already gone. Now, a second thing that we should say is that in spite of the weakness of a state, we have a state system that has functioned continuously for all the past century. We were there, all the countries of Latin America, and the Caribbean joined later. All the countries of the Americas were original members of the United Nations. None of them has changed. No countries have disappeared, no countries have appeared, no real big border changes have existed, and that has part of what we spoke about the stability. We are a region which has a great abundance of natural resources. We are net exporters of food, net exporters of commodities, and one of the largest sources of drinking water in the world. So we have a lot of reserves in that matter, and we are not by far the most contaminated region in the world, even though I must admit that lately we have been growing in that area in a negative way. I already spoke about the stability. We continue to enjoy peace, and we have more inserted in the world. And this is where really, and we are trying to solve some problems among our countries. I should say that the Inter-American system, the system of independent countries of the Americas, is based on three basic principles. One is it's all sovereign nations, We're all sovereign, even the smallest country. We have a country of 300 million, and we have a country of 80,000. But they all, I mean, they're all considered independent nations. Second, it's the issue of, and therefore, non-intervention is something that's very essential for the politics of Latin America. Second, we have the idea that every country should belong to the system. I mean, we're inclusive, the idea of inclusion. And third, the idea of democracy. And sometimes you have hard compatibilizing the three principles. That is a fact. That is certainly a problem. But we have certainly, but that desire to stay together and to work together has remained for a long time, and it's also a very important matter. I mean, actually, as I said before, we have 34 member countries, but the next summit of the Americas is going to be a first in the region. The Latin America, I mean, all the countries of the America are going to be there. Between the old idea that the countries that are not completely democratic should be separated, and the idea of full inclusiveness, we make a bet for full inclusiveness. We made it 6 years ago at the OAS, and Cuba is going to be present for the first time at the Summit of the Americas. Not back in the system, but certainly a great beginning, made possible by the decision of the US government to take a different policy than the one it has usually held against Cuba. As you know, all the other countries of the Americas have normal relations with Cuba and have had them for the past, well, not so many years. I mean, El Salvador was the first one, the last one to reestablish them about 6 years ago. So that's certainly something that we have achieved. And countries in the region have moved very strongly also to open links with other regions of the world. This has been grossly exaggerated. If you look at the aggregate figures of the region, the US continues to be the most important partner of Latin America and the Caribbean, both in trade and in investment. And that has not really changed in spite of the boom of China's trade and to some extent of investments also coming from China. Europe continues to be a very strong partner of our region. What has really happened is that, I mean, Latin American countries, after all, and Caribbean countries have grown and certainly need relations, normal relations, with all the world. But the basic problem here is of lack of integration. There's a lot of talk about integration in Latin America, a lot of talk. We began talking about integration at the same time that the European Union did. And we still have stayed basically in the realm of the rhetoric. We have several organizations, several groupings, but none of them really faces the issue of economic and political integration. However, the desire, I mean, I think that's my point of view. That's not going to happen until there is some kind of a larger consensus among countries on the main features of their political and economic regimes. I've always felt that. I mean, I think that the European Union was made possible by the fact that even with pluralism, some of the basic features of the political and economic regime were consensual. In Latin America, even in spite of the fact that countries very much want to work together and practice almost exaggeratedly a policy of non-aggression and non-intervention, they still don't share many of the ideas about the way in which the system should be organized, and that's noticeable in every world. Finally, I should say that when you talk about integration, of course, you are talking about not a hemisphere, you're talking about a hemisphere of regions. I mean, there's a South America, there's a Central America, there's the Caribbean, and there's North America. And even though, as I said, the U.S. trades very much with I mean, it's, one can always say that Latin America is the best partner, the best economic partner of the U.S. That's true. I mean, the U.S. exports much more to Latin America than to any other place in the world. But of course, if you cut Mexico out, that still remains generally true, but it's most, I mean, the fact that Mexico is the second economic partner of the US is very visible if you look at the figures. So actually, but we are a continent of regions, as I said. When we talk about integration, one thing that we must leave aside is the idea of the famous dream of Bolivar, or as Jorge Volpi has said, the insomnia of Bolivar, of just one region from the North Pole to the Tierra del Fuego, something like that. If we have integration, we are going to have it basically originally in the regions, and from there developing further. That's a fact not only from the economic, but also from the political side. However, I should say that, but just to finish this, that hemispheric relations do play a role. I mean, there are a lot of things that unite us. After all, the system was created in 1889. The Organization of American States is the older region in the world, the older institution in the world, excuse me. The oldest institution in the world. It has never stopped to function. And even if normally, this is very normal. As was remembered here, I was in government in my country in 1973. I was very young then, but they were already talking about some kind of a different Latin American organization, etc. That may be a fact. Those things have to appear at a regional level. But we have many issues which have to deal together. Trade is one. I mean, regulating trade about the countries in the region is a very important thing. And even though the free trade agreement of the Americas could not be finished, we have had so many trade agreements lately that really, that practically we have a big zone of free trade that goes from Canada to Chile and leaves aside only some countries in the Atlantic. That is a fact. We have other problems that are also not that nice. The issues of crime that I mentioned, and the drug trade covers all the region. We published a report on this matter about 2 years ago. All the regions have suffered from the same, all the countries in the region suffer one or another way the problems of criminality and organized crime. And we have migration. 80% of the Latin Americans or the Americans travel from the south to the north. And that's something, therefore you cannot talk about migration without being at without taking into consideration the whole of the hemisphere. I mean, the second country in the world to which Latins, to which the region mostly migrates is not Spain or not, it's Argentina. But even in that condition, it still accounts for about 10% of the migrants of a region, which, by the way, migrates at twice the speed of the world migration. We have problems of several, and when we have issues in which we have always worked together. Our main achievements in matters of democracy are not endorsable to anybody else. I mean, we had an election in Bolivia yesterday, and as you know, the Bolivian government is not precisely a government that's very affectionate to the region, but they wanted, especially to the OAS, but they wanted an observation mission from the Organization of American States. They didn't want any other one. And we account for that. We have a system of human rights. That's the only system that's valid in the region. So we have an agenda. And we have the member countries who want very much to be there. If you look at the delegations that come to the Organization of American States, there are several foreign ministers or soon-to-be ministers in their countries. The Minister of Peru goes from the OAS to be Minister, the Ambassador of Peru goes from the OAS to be Minister of the Interior in his country. The Foreign Minister of Haiti came from the Organization of American States. We have former presidents there. But we have a member that's not participating as much as we would want them to have. I mean, this contradicts completely what you have heard about the Organization of American States many times. The U.S. has been very much absent from there. But I would say that the presence of the U.S. has been very much missed in the multilateral system in these years. I mean, as some left-wing politicians said in the region, we have changed very much in the past decade while the eagle was looking to another place.
Yeah.
He's saying something that we very much believe. We haven't had much success in the past decade in having the organization, the U.S. not only participating in the Organization of American States, but also with problems in the American Development Bank, problems with the member countries. There are several countries that still don't have a U.S. ambassador, and they don't have an ambassador in the U.S. That is creating a big difficulty for us. I mean, the risk here is that, and I would say that is more valid, of course, for South America than for Central America and the Caribbean. I mean, let's be frank. I mean, Central America and the Caribbean are in the area of influence of the United States, and they wouldn't have any choice but to be members of that system. But South American countries are really, I mean, there is a risk in the distancing. Actually, somebody referred to this the other day very strongly. Somebody wrote I tried to remember who wrote a piece on this about the separation, the distance that is coming between the larger countries to the south and the larger countries to the north. And that is something that is dangerous for the hemisphere, for different reasons. Well, I'm sorry about some disorder at some time, but I'm very much willing to take any questions that you want to make. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Go ahead. Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, my name is Matias. I'm a visiting PhD from the University of Brasilia. I have a short question. You mentioned at some point of your presentation. Sorry?
Más fuerte, very forte.
You mentioned at some point of your presentation that there were some cases in which the charter of the democracy wasn't fully enforced. Could you expand on which cases that happened?
Well, actually, in those cases, I mean, I shouldn't mention countries, but in all those cases in which there's no agreement among the countries to apply it. I was the other day looking at my record, and the Inter-American Democratic Charter has been applied about 7 or 8 times in these past 10 years. One, of course, is Honduras. Paraguay is a very strange system. I'll leave it for the end. Twice in Bolivia, once in Nicaragua, once in Guatemala, twice in Ecuador, and always at the request of the governments, except Honduras, of course, in which the OAS decided that there had been a coup, and therefore they should act even without the agreement of the de facto government of Honduras. In the case of Paraguay, it was very strange because the countries that were against, I mean, that felt that there had been a coup, decided not to present the matter in the council and let it be, because they knew that there would be no agreement for that. And they practically gave carte blanche to the Secretary General to do everything that we had to do to send a mission to Paraguay and make sure that democracy was restored, or that the normalcy was restored, which is something that really happened. What happened with the other country, because which is Venezuela? There has never been an agreement to deal with the matter. The OAS is a multilateral institution. It's not a supranational institution. It's a multilateral institution. And frankly, the attempts to discuss the issue of Venezuela in the region have not, the system have not been accepted by the member countries. We have discussed very recently a very lively discussion in Council because the Venezuelan government asked for it, and not in terms of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, just in terms of doing it. So actually that's the answer. I mean, this is as the founder of the OAS, or the first Secretary General, Alberto Lleras Camargo, the president after that president of Colombia, said, this organization will be exactly what its member countries want it to be. And that's the basic reason.
Great. Go ahead.
Down there.
Yeah. I wanted to go ahead. The lady first.
I was just wondering if you think that youth unemployment is a challenge that's facing the region, and if so, do you think that this is best addressed at the regional level, the national, or the urban?
I think it is a problem. It is a problem, certainly. As you know, there's a certain expression of the ninis. I mean, the young people in Latin America who don't work and don't go to school. The figure has declined. I mean, we had that was about 1 in every 4. Now it's 1 in every 5 and a little bit more. So that has improved. But the problem of lack of opportunity certainly is affecting permanently some sectors of society, and that has a lot to do with lack of social mobility and a lot of migration also. The figures are different according to the countries, but lately in this slow growth, I'm sorry to say that I think that the figures, at least the provisional figures we have been increasing, and there are no real programs to improve youth initiative and youth. And then there's the issue of the quality of education also, which, as you know, is not a very satisfactory in Latin America, to say the least.
Good. I would like to ask if you could speak a little bit more about the role of the United States in democratization, in particular with your experience in the popular unity government and also the plebiscite. You have a lifelong understanding of sort of U.S.-Latin American relations, and I'd be interested if you could just characterize the more recent years within that broader framework.
Well, I think that, yes, of course, I mean, I'm not one who believes, for example, that as I read it by somebody the other day, that the OAS has had a continuous life. I mean, it doesn't have a continuous life. There was a time in which the OAS was very much used for intervention in different countries of the region. And that is very much remembered in the cases of Arbenz in '54, in the Dominican Republic in '65, in Chile also in '73, and in other countries too. I mean, there was a large degree of intervention in Central America in the '80s. I think that is very much something that has not happened recently. And I think that that's something that there's no room for it to happen. So when some countries say, and I very much remember, but let me tell you, this is not only a political matter, it's also a cultural matter to a certain extent. I remember when in the midst of the crisis of Honduras, somebody who was, I would say, among the liberals I've known here in the States, properly liberals, very strongly asked Tom Shannon, who was at that time Assistant Secretary of State, Tom, why is this going on? Why don't we do something? And he said, well, what would you prefer, gunboats or blockades? I mean, that's what we did before. He said, now we're not doing it. And I think that's a very good, I mean, actually, a big conscience of the U.S. A certain conscience now that not everything is possible in the political field. I myself believe, for example, that the decision of the other day was a wrong decision. Actually, I mean, the idea of declaring Venezuela a threat to national security, it was necessary to apply sanctions. But the real result was that no real sanctions were applied. The countries of Latin America reacted in general, criticizing it, and Mr. Maduro got special powers to govern by decree until the end of the year. So that shows that it was a wrong decision, but it shows also some degree of weakness. Now, I must admit for me that's a very welcome change. I've always been against that, and I said when I joined the organization for the first time, I said, no, during my tenure, no interventions whatsoever. I think that era has gone. Maybe some people in this country don't understand that enough. They would still like to have the OAS to do something about it when they are in minority in the countries, but I very much share the idea that the president of this country, President Obama, put forward when he was running for president. That was brave because he was running for president. He wasn't the president-elect, he was the candidate. I mean that democracy is not imposed from outside. It has to be built inside the countries. And I very much think that most of the region will share that notion.
But I wanted to follow that, if I may quickly, sorry. And that is, and you brought it up in so many ways. Yes, the US may be missing, but then one of the biggest challenges one feels as an interested outside observer for the region, especially in the south, is drugs and all the insecurities fear, angst, and criminality linked to drugs. So, are there any plans within OAS to deal with this, which is basically a regional, I like when you said, well, that's a real regional issue.
Well, actually, 2 years ago, no, 3 years ago, it's changed as much time passes. We have a summit every 3 years. So, and the next summit is in 2 weeks from now, so that was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
The presidents of Latin America and the leaders of the region, all the region, President Obama was there, the Prime Minister of Canada was also there, discussed the issue in a private meeting and they ended up with the decision to ask the Organization of American States to prepare a full report, which was actually 2 full reports. One was a report on the state of the art in matters of drugs at that moment, and the other was what are the choices. We complied. That report has been published, and the choices are really there. And they have begun a discussion. I would say that, in general, of course, we did not expect that the countries would follow immediately some of the ideas of the report. I mean, one of the ideas of the report was especially that if you're going to deal with the problem of drugs from I would say, a public health point of view, you should stop sending to jail people for using drugs. I mean, the number of people who are in jail in this region for using drugs is enormous. I mean, and we have moved forward into that. And I should say that also we work with several countries in creating drug courts and other things, and they're very encouraged by what the U.S. government is doing in terms of reducing the sentences for people who are in jail for small offenses. There has been a movement also towards the legalization of some drugs in the region, but the big problem, especially in the transit countries, the 2 big problems are first the money. I mean, we have a study there in our report that shows that a kilo of coca paste in the jungle of Bolivia costs about $550 to $700, which is a lot of money for a Bolivian peasant. And then it moves across the region, and when it ends up in the streets of a big American city, it's around $300,000, $300,000 because it's turned into 2 kilos of refined cocaine. Everybody makes the money with the trade. Everybody makes money with the trade, and the money laundering is rampant. And by the way, I would say that 2/3 of the money, even though 2/3 of the money remain in the countries in which it's been used, final use. But in Latin America, the third of that part, and the one that goes to Europe by way of the Amazon and into the Atlantic, is funding a very large number of organized crime. That's one problem. The other problem is the violence, and the violence has to do again with the quality of state policy in our region. I mean, I think it was a Nobel Prize. It was an American Nobel Prize. Gary Becker, who delved a lot into the matters of violence and crime, and he showed very, I mean, according as I feel showed completely that the importance in matters of crime is much more important to certainty of being punished is much more important than the size of the penalties. In Latin America and the Caribbean, and even in the States, even you have a lot of penalties for the drug crimes and all that, and a very low degree of compliance. And that happens mainly in the countries in which drugs are being transported, basically from Colombia up to the north, up to Mexico, and some countries of the Caribbean. If you look at the devils, where do the trade, does the violence is reduced? In countries in which there's more compliance. In some countries in South America, in Central America, you have 96% impunity for crimes. So, I mean, what's the point? 96%. Two countries of Central America have 96% compliance. No, 96%, excuse me, non-compliance, non-compliance. And that, of course, is a recipe for the violence to continue. Not only from the point of view of the offenders, but unfortunately from the point of view of the victims. Because if you find, they kill one of your brothers, and you know that there's a 4% chance that the criminal will be, even if identified, will be punished, you will probably go and hire somebody to do it for you. And that is something that's really very, there's a big problem today. I think that there hasn't been any success. But some governments are trying very hard to work on the violence issue, which is what really scares people in the region. I mean, most people will say that. They're not so much concerned about the drug consumption, they're concerned about the violence that it carries with it.
That's right.
Jeff Laurenti, Mr. Secretary General, you had closed your remarks intriguingly, saying that the United States is absent from the OAS and that its presence is missed, which is a little bit of a shock, given that one had the sense that for most of Latin America a half century ago, the thought was the United States cracked the whip over the OAS and controlled its majorities. What do you, and its politics, particularly on the obsession of U.S. foreign policy at the time, which was anti-communism, to what do you attribute the U.S. kind of disappearance from the OAS? Is it that it no longer controls it, so it's no longer interested? Or that you've become the new Canada, no longer on the American radar screen? And why don't Latin American countries rejoice in this, that now they're able to run the organization themselves?
Well,
what is it that they would like to get done that the Americans keep them from doing?
Well, I would say that, no, I'm not saying, I mean, actually, when President Obama went to the first summit he attended, this is going to be the third, he was very clear in saying, look, he said that forget about the previous ways in which we acted. We are going to act together with you. He even said something that everybody remembers much more in Latin America than in the States. He said, I want to make policy with you and not for you. Yeah. And that was very well received. I mean, because actually, I mean, nobody wants to have, I mean, yes, of course, when I say nobody, I admit that there's some rhetoric in the Americas, some president there who says we should have an OAS without the United States and without Canada. But really, I mean, the large majority of the countries have a very practical policy. And I always remember there was a poll that was a good poll, but it was not very much. It was not enough publicized. That showed that when you ask Latin Americans in every country, with which country would you like to have a free trade agreement, they answered the U.S. The other case was the only deviant case was Venezuela, but not so much for ideological reasons. I think that the real reason is that Venezuela has a free trade agreement with the U.S. I mean, 90% of Venezuelan exports to the U.S. is oil, and they are completely free. And by the way, it's the only country that's paying for the oil at this moment, so you have to take care of that. So actually, but then there was the other question. How much would you say that these countries can be trusted? I would say that it was a healthy 50-50. Because of course the US is too powerful to say that you completely trust everything it's going to do, really. I mean, I think that a healthy degree of mistrust is necessary. So there's not a real question of not having relations with the US of trying to go along, except in some radical groups or some ideological groups that really don't make much sense. If you go around the region, there's no real problem with that. And as I say, they continue sending their best ambassadors not only to the US, but also to the Organization of American States, which is certainly not that as important as the bilateral relations. No, I think that the big problem of absence has been, as some very relevant actors have said, basically a fact that as again, a dear friend said, which I already named, I will not name him now because I'm not sure if I can quote it. Similar, quite a large meeting. Well, you have to understand, he said that there are so many problems going on around the world, and we're involved in most of them. Actually, let me tell you a story which I told the other day, so I think it already, if there was something that if I violated some trust, I already did it. But when I was received in the White House by President Bush immediately after coming to I mean, all his, okay, he was concerned about Venezuela, and he received some people from the opposition later, but his main message was stability. This is a region in which we have no real unmanageable conflicts, he said. So, I mean, we want to keep it that way. We don't want any trouble with Latin America. But I think that the problem is that that concept, which has been followed, did not consider the possibility of a distancing. Only of some, we haven't had real conflicts. Let me tell you, really, we haven't had real, by the way, everybody talks a lot about the OAS, but when they have a problem, they bring it to the OAS. The other day, Venezuela brought to the OAS the issue of this question of being declared a threat. But it was the first time that somebody asked for a special meeting to complain about the OAS in a long time. So there's no real, we don't have real problems. What we have is a situation that may be good for some, for me it's a bad thing, of a parallel advancement, in which, by the way, the president is going to the summit. Every time that they are asked, the president of the US and the prime minister of Canada, and they will say that the only organization which is valid for them is the Organization of American States. But very frankly, I don't think that that's being backed by a strong policy there. But just one last example. As I said before, at the beginning of President Obama's government, we did have when he said, as I said before, this was 100 days after being inaugurated. I want to make policy for you and not with you and not for you. And actually that happened. I mean, that summit was possible because we agreed not to discuss the Cuban matter. And we would discuss it 1 month later, 1.5 months later at the OAS. And actually we did. And we came up with a solution. We lifted the sanctions. And contrary to what most papers say, the US was not the final obstacle to lift the sanctions. It was the countries on the left that didn't want to push Cuba back into the system, and were concerned about that. We begin to discuss the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the Convention on Human Rights, etc. But finally, we brought back, we invited Cuba to come back to the organization, and as the administration had predicted, it did not happen. It was a gamble, but it did not happen because Cuba was not willing and has not been willing yet to sit itself again in the Inter-American system. The summit of a couple of weeks from now is the first time they've done it. Then we had the coup d'etat in Cuba, in Honduras. And we worked together. I mean, the US was strongly against the regime in Cuba and in Honduras, excuse me. And even if they sometimes they try to do things differently, actually it was the sanctions of the US that convinced the Hondurans that they had to change their policy. I mean, it's for a lot of people in Central America, the worst thing you can do to them is to get them to take their visas out, and that I think played a very important role. So actually, it happened at the beginning, but then it stopped happening. And I believe that it was basically because the U.S. was involved in other conflicts, other problems, and there was not the capacity to deal with them as strongly as we can, as they should. If you read a paper by the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard Haas. I mean, that was a very interesting paper on the second Bush administration. where he refers to the priorities of the political, foreign policy priorities of the administration. Europe is not there. Latin America is not there. I mean, Sudan is there, and the Gulf of Burma is there, and several others. All the conflicts are there. And I think that has happened with U.S. policy in the past. It's not a matter of Latin America. I'm not a masochist about that. It's something that has happened because of the great involvement of the U.S. in other countries that, by the way, also brings the best diplomats to go to those countries. I mean, and does not increase the quality of the people that are working on Latin American affairs.
Well,
Sorry about that. Huh?
No. Really, really interesting. And actually, I know there are many more questions, but unfortunately, we have a tight academic schedule in here. But you really managed brilliantly now to come from the in-depth discussion of local and regional into a global matter.
Thank you very much.
And
Thank you very much.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.